Before the first flak burst reached their altitude, the crew already understood something about this mission felt final, though no one could have explained why. Dawnlight stretched thin across the horizon as the bomber formation pushed east, engines droning with a steady vibration that seeped through metal and bone alike. The aircraft carried scars from previous sorties, patched aluminum panels reflecting pale sunlight in uneven shades. Inside, the air smelled of heated oil, canvas, and oxygen rubber. Each crewman moved through practice checks with quiet efficiency earned over months of survival. The pilot monitored manifold pressure while glancing at fuel consumption figures that crept slightly higher than expected. Navigational charts were clipped carefully against turbulence, pencil marks layered over earlier routes flown by crews who never returned. The war had reached a stage where losses were calculated into planning, and every flight deeper into enemy territory felt less like a mission and more like a negotiation with probability. Reports before takeoff confirmed expanding defensive networks ahead, but Strategic Command insisted these targets could shorten the conflict. No one questioned orders anymore. They simply absorbed them, folding fear into routine like another checklist item under constant silent pressure every second. At altitude, temperature dropped until frost traced patterns along interior seams, reminding everyone how thin the barrier was between them and the stratosphere. The bombardier recalibrated instruments repeatedly as crosswinds shifted unpredictably, forcing constant corrections that slowly drained concentration. Radio chatter carried fragments of other crews reporting light damage or formation adjustments, but nothing yet suggested disaster. Still, the flight engineer noticed a subtle fluctuation in Engine 3's exhaust temperature, small enough to ignore under normal circumstances, yet persistent enough to watch. He logged readings carefully, aware that minor irregularities often preceded cascading failure when combined with combat stress. The tail gunner rotated his turret through slow arcs, scanning empty sky that felt too quiet, knowing enemy fighters prefer to strike after flak-weakened formations. Oxygen mass amplified breathing sounds, turning each inhale into a mechanical rhythm that merged with engine noise. Hours into the flight, muscles stiffened, and every movement required conscious effort. Strategic briefings had emphasized urgency, describing rail hubs and fuel depots as critical to shortening the war's final phase. Yet up here, surrounded by cloud layers and distant contrails, the objective felt abstract compared to the immediate reality of metal fatigue, freezing airflow, and the knowledge. As they crossed the coastline marking the edge of hostile territory, anti-aircraft bursts began appearing below like dark flowers opening in slow motion. The pilot held formation position with small, precise control inputs, knowing even minor drift could expose them to concentrated fire. Shock waves from distant explosions thudded through the fuselage, vibrating instrument needles and rattling loose fittings. The navigator called heading adjustments while calculating wind drift against ground speed, his voice steady but increasingly clipped. Fragments of shrapnel occasionally struck outer surfaces with sharp metallic pings, each impact a reminder that statistics alone could not predict survival. The aircraft's electrical system flickered briefly, resetting one navigation display before stabilizing again. No alarm sounded, yet the crew exchanged brief glances that carried unspoken concern. Fuel mixture required constant adjustment as altitude and temperature shifted, adding another layer of workload during the most dangerous phase of the approach. Enemy searchlights began probing cloud edges, white beams sliding across vapor layers like fingers searching for texture. The formation tightened instinctively, aircraft silhouettes overlapping against pale sky. Somewhere ahead, the target zone waited, protected by overlapping gun batteries designed specifically to break formations into isolated, vulnerable aircraft within constant lethal engagement envelopes daily. Flak density increased as they approached bombing altitude, black bursts merging into gray smoke layers that reduced visibility and distorted depth perception. The bombardier struggled to maintain visual confirmation through intermittent cloud and smoke interference, recalculating release timing repeatedly. The aircraft shuddered as a near detonation rocked the right wing, sending vibration through control cables and structural ribs. The flight engineer immediately rechecked engine gauges, noting engine 3 now running hotter than safety margins allowed. Oil pressure remained stable, but temperature climbed steadily, suggesting internal damage. The pilot considered feathering propeller, but knew losing thrust here could drop them behind formation, where survival odds plummeted. Instead, he ordered reduced power to slow thermal stress, sacrificing speed for engine preservation. The decision placed him slightly below optimal formation spacing, increasing exposure to defensive fire. Another flak burst ruptured a section of outer fuselage insulation, allowing freezing air to roar through a narrow seam, scattering frost and dust. Crew members tightened harnesses instinctively, bracing against unpredictable shock waves. Training dictated calm procedural responses, yet adrenaline sharpened every sound, every vibration, every indicator needle drifting toward unacceptable ranges. No one spoke unnecessarily, conserving oxygen and focus while waiting for the moment bombs would. The target markers finally appeared through broken cloud, faint geometric outlines of industrial structures surrounded by defensive emplacements. The bombardier called final approach corrections while steadying shaking hands against the sighting frame. The aircraft held course despite turbulence generated by overlapping explosions below. Bomb release triggered a sudden lightness through the fuselage, followed by immediate banking instructions to exit the zone. Anti-aircraft fire intensified briefly as ground gunners attempted to track retreating bombers, filling the sky with chaotic bursts. The pilot pushed engines carefully, balancing escape speed against the damaged engine's temperature limits. As they cleared the heaviest defenses, the crew allowed themselves measured breaths, though tension remained locked in muscles and posture. The radio operator transmitted damage reports and formation status, his voice hoarse from recycled oxygen and stress. Behind them, smoke columns marked the target area, but no one watched for long. Focus shifted entirely to survival and the long flight home. The war had trained them to accept success and loss simultaneously, knowing missions rarely ended cleanly. Even now, subtle vibrations through the airframe hinted that mechanical problems were only beginning, reminding everyone that endurance, not skill alone, would determine who reached friendly territory by dawn tomorrow. Before the engines reached full power, the crew already felt the cold pressing to the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, a living reminder of altitude, distance, and consequence. Frost traced faint veins along the inside of the forward canopy, catching weak dawn light as ground crew pulled chocks away. The aircraft vibrated with restrained violence, for radial engines coughing into synchronized thunder. Inside, each man moved through rehearsed motions while pretending not to notice the silence between checklists. Word taught them that silence meant thinking, and thinking often led to fear. Today's target lay deep beyond defended territory. Takeoff rolled them forward into roaring acceleration, runway lights streaking past like tracer lines beneath mist. The pilot held the yoke steady while crosswinds nudged the heavy bomber sideways, tires rattling across expansion seams. At rotation, speed the nose lifted reluctantly, and the ground fell away in a slow, irreversible surrender. Gear retracted with mechanical groans that echoed through the fuselage ribs. No one spoke as they climbed into layered clouds that swallowed the world below. Oxygen masks hung ready but unused, swaying slightly with turbulence. In these first minutes, routine disguised danger, and muscle memory carried them through complex sequences. Above the weather, sunlight struck the wings with blinding brilliance, revealing faint rivet lines and patches from earlier repairs. The navigator adjusted charts beneath a dim red lamp, calculating wind drift, while pencil marks vibrated with engine harmonics. Radio static whispered constantly, occasionally breaking into clip formation updates. Far ahead, tiny metallic shapes marked other bombers holding disciplined spacing, each aircraft representing another fragile island of men and machinery. The gunners rotated turrets in slow arcs, scanning empty sky that still felt crowded with unseen threats. They knew enemy fighters could climb invisibly through sun glare or cloud shadow, appearing suddenly. The bombardier lay prone in the glass nose, watching distant terrain drift beneath scattered cloud holes. Rivers looked harmless from altitude, like thin ribbons sewn into farmland, yet everyone understood how fiercely defended those crossings could be. He adjusted sighting controls, breathing slowly to steady hands already stiff from cold. Behind him, the flight engineer monitored fuel mixture and cylinder temperatures, listening for subtle changes that could signal catastrophic failure. Every gauge needle became a moral weight, because mechanical problems did not arrive dramatically. They crept quietly, forcing decisions measured in seconds. Each man privately reviewed emergency procedures, while outwardly, time stretched strangely during crews. Minutes felt interchangeable, defined only by minor course corrections and periodic position reports. The tail gunner hummed a tune he barely remembered learning as a child, the vibration turning melody into something mechanical and hollow. Frost crept along interior frames despite heating systems working constantly. Condensation formed where warm breath met frozen metal, creating tiny crystal gardens that shattered when touched. War transformed even beauty into a reminder of fragility. Letters from home rested folded in breast pockets, paper edges worn soft from rereading during sleepless nights before missions. Those pages carried smells of soap. Hours passed before the formation tightened, signaling approach toward defended airspace. Radios carried sharper voices now, clipped by tension rather than protocol. The pilot flexed gloved fingers, easing stiffness while reviewing escape headings memorized during briefing. Sun position shifted, casting long shadows across instrument panels. The crew adjusted goggles, knowing glare could hide approaching interceptors until it was too late. Below, cloud cover thinned, revealing rail yards and factory complexes feeding the enemy war machine. The sight produced conflicting emotions. Professional focus mixed with recognition that thousands of workers below lived lives as ordinary and complicated as their own families. Flak bursts began as distant black smudges, then multiplied into violent flowers of smoke and shrapnel. The aircraft jolted repeatedly as pressure waves slammed the fuselage. Training took over. The pilot held formation despite instinct screaming to dive away. The smell of burned explosive residue seeped through ventilation ducts, mixing with oil and heated metal. The top turret gunner called corrections calmly, voice steady from repetition. Below, explosions peppered the sky at varying altitudes, forming lethal layers of formation had across. Each second inside the barrage felt stretched and fragile, like glass about to crack under invisible pressure silently. Despite chaos outside, interior discipline held. The navigator called minor course adjustments to keep bomb run timing precise. The bombardier verified release circuits, toggling switches protected by red guards. Crew communication remained clipped and factual, conserving oxygen and emotional energy. Yet every man felt the aircraft vibrating differently now, subtle tremors suggesting damage somewhere beyond immediate visibility. Rivets popped occasionally with sharp metallic ticks. The flight engineer logged anomalies while calculating remaining fuel margins if an engine failed. Calculations replaced hope, turning survival into mathematics measured by altitude, distance, and diminishing mechanical reliability under constant operational stress and growing strain. As they approached the initial point, tension shifted from anticipation to execution. The pilot leveled wings with microscopic precision, while flak intensified around them. Sunlight flashed across nearby aircraft, revealing fresh holes torn through control surfaces. Some bombers drifted slightly out of formation, wounded but still flying. The bombardier took full control, guiding the aircraft through final seconds of alignment. Wind buffeted the nose, forcing constant correction. Inside his sight, the target complex appeared disturbingly calm, untouched by the violence exploding above. He focused on crosshairs, blocking out imagination, blocking out consequences, existing only within mechanical duty beyond personal limits. Bomb release came with a subtle shudder, followed by sudden lightness as weight vanished from the bomb bay. The aircraft lurched upward slightly, engines straining against altered balance. The bombardier confirmed drop visually, voice calm though throat burned from recycled oxygen. Almost immediately, the pilot initiated evasive turn, pushing engines toward maximum safe output. Flak continued chasing them, but distance slowly widened. No cheering erupted, only quiet acknowledgement that one phase had ended. Survival remained uncertain, yet professionalism kept fear contained. Each man returned to assigned instruments, already preparing mentally for the long, dangerous journey back across hostile skies again. The first indication that something was wrong came not as a violent shock, but as a subtle change in vibration, a faint shudder passing through the bomber's long fuselage like a tremor moving through bone. The pilot felt it through control column before any warning light flickered, an unnatural rhythm layered beneath the steady engine pulse. Outside, the skies still flashed with scattered flak bursts, but inside the aircraft the atmosphere shifted towards something quieter and more dangerous. The flight engineer leaned closer to his instrument panel, eyes scanning gauges whose needles now trembled with tiny irregularities. Cylinder head temperature on the number 3 engine crept higher than normal. Not yet catastrophic, but no longer trustworthy. He adjusted mixture slightly, listening through the airframe for a confirmation that the change helped. It did not. The engine continued producing power, but its tone carried a strained metallic edge that suggested internal damage. None of them needed to say it aloud. Damage rarely announced itself clearly. It accumulated silently, hiding inside systems designed to appear stable until they were not. Flak continued bursting around the formation, forcing minor altitude adjustments that complicated already fragile engine balance. The pilot compensated instinctively, but every correction increased strain across wings and mounting brackets already stressed by explosive shock waves. The navigator called headings, voice calm but clipped, aware that precision mattered even more now. Fuel consumption shifted unpredictably when engines ran unevenly, and small miscalculations could place them short of safe territory later. Behind him, the radio operator struggled to maintain clear transmission. Static surged and fell unpredictably, suggesting antenna damage or partial power loss to communication systems. He adjusted frequency again, hoping to confirm position reports from nearby aircraft, but responses came fragmented and delayed. The isolation began quietly, not as sudden separation, but as gradual reduction in certainty. Without reliable radio, formation cohesion depended entirely on visual alignment, and smoke from nearby explosions made that increasingly difficult. The first physical sign inside the aircraft appeared when a sharp metallic crack echoed to the forward fuselage, followed by a sudden draft of freezing air. The bombardier turned instinctively, spotting a jagged puncture just behind the nose compartment where shrapnel had torn through outer skin. The hole was small but significant. At this altitude, even minor breaches allowed extreme cold to flood interior compartments, numbing fingers and slowing reaction time. He pulled emergency patch material from a storage pouch and pressed it over the opening, sealing it with adhesive strips while his gloves stiffened from frost. The repair would hold temporarily, but everyone understood that structural integrity was no longer guaranteed. The aircraft was still flying, still controllable, still part of the formation, yet the illusion of invulnerability had ended. They were now surviving on margins measured in millimeters of aluminum and the continued cooperation of damaged machinery. Minutes passed, and the number 3 engine temperature climbed further. The flight engineer reduced power slightly to prevent seizure, but the reduction forced the remaining engines to compensate. Fuel mixture adjustments spread the strain unevenly across the power system. The pilot recalculated cruise capability silently, knowing maximum range was now theoretical rather than real. He thought briefly of training manuals describing engine-out procedures, diagrams showing ideal response sequences under controlled conditions. None of those diagrams accounted for flak damage, freezing airflow, and unpredictable radio failure simultaneously. Combat turned clean procedures into improvisation. The crew adapted, not by following perfect steps, but by balancing risk against survival second by second. Every decision closed one door, while opening another possibility of failure, somewhere else inside the machine. Another impact struck somewhere near the right wing root, producing a heavy thud that vibrated through seat frames and bulkheads. Warning lights flickered momentarily, then stabilized. The flight engineer checked hydraulic pressure. It held, but barely. Landing gear extension reliability was now uncertain. No one commented on it, but the implications settled across the crew like weight. They were still hundreds of miles from friendly airfields. The tail gunner reported reduced rotation speed in his turret, possibly from damaged electrical lines or debris lodged in mechanical tracks. Defensive coverage narrowed by degrees, leaving blind angles where enemy fighters could approach unseen. He rotated manually to compensate, muscles straining against cold, stiffened joints. Physical exhaustion arrived early during missions like this, not from dramatic action, but from constant resistance against vibration, cold, and fear. The formation itself showed signs of strain. Some bombers drifted slightly above or below assigned altitude bands, likely managing their own damage. Maintaining tight formation became harder when every pilot balanced different mechanical failures. Yet doctrine demanded cohesion because isolated aircraft became immediate targets. The pilot held position carefully, watching the lead bomber's tail markings through intermittent smoke. He ignored growing numbness in his feet, focusing instead on micro-adjustments that kept him inside protective spacing. The navigator updated drift calculations again, factoring changing wind currents at their slightly altered altitude. Mathematics replaced comfort. Numbers offered structure when physical reality became chaotic. Even so, each calculation now included wider error margins, acknowledging that precision instruments meant little if airframe stability continued degrading. Inside the fuselage, small sounds multiplied. Loose fragments rattled somewhere behind bulkheads. Insulation strips fluttered in newly formed drafts. The smell of overheated oil thickened slightly, mixing with cordite residue from flak bursts. Sensory overload built gradually, not dramatic enough to cause panic, but relentless enough to erode concentration. The crew spoke less, conserving focus. Each man retreated partially into internal space, where procedures repeated automatically. Fatigue mixed with adrenaline in a disorienting cycle. They were not yet in immediate mortal crisis, yet they were no longer operating within design safety limits. That psychological threshold mattered. It changed how every decision felt. Actions once routine now carried emotional weight, because failure consequences were no longer hypothetical. As a damaged engine continued running under reduced output, the aircraft slowly lost a fraction of its original speed. The pilot compensated with minor power increases elsewhere, but fuel calculations shifted again. The navigator confirmed they could still reach safe territory if no additional major failures occurred. The conditional nature of that statement hung unspoken in the cockpit. Everyone understood how fragile conditional survival truly was. The radio operator finally established partial contact with another bomber slightly ahead, confirming general formation direction. The connection faded again, but even brief confirmation restored some sense of belonging within the larger aerial structure. They were still part of something bigger than their individual aircraft. That mattered psychologically, even if mechanical reality continued narrowing their options. The sky ahead looked deceptively calm now. Flak burst thinning as they cleared the heaviest defensive zone. Sunlight returned across the wings, revealing fresh shrapnel scoring along leading edges. The aircraft remained airborne, still moving, still carrying them homeward. Yet every system now operated under invisible strain. The bomber was no longer simply flying. It was enduring. The bomber's position within the formation shifted so gradually that no single crew member could identify the exact moment separation began. Yet all of them felt it in subtle ways that bypassed instruments and settled directly into instinct. Visual references grew inconsistent as thin smoke layers smeared the horizon and sunlight scattered unpredictably across broken cloud tops. The pilot compensated with constant minor corrections, but damaged engine output forced the aircraft slightly lower and slower than surrounding bombers. Distance opened in meters first, then in psychological space. The comforting geometry of formation flying, drilled through endless training hours, began dissolving into something uncertain and exposed. Through the side windows, other aircraft still occupied the sky, yet their spacing no longer felt protective. Each bomber now seemed like an individual survivor, navigating the same violent environment, rather than parts of a single shielded structure. The navigator recalculated drift again, factoring wind shear caused by rising thermal columns from fires far below. Numbers changed faster than expected, forcing him to cross-check slide rule calculations twice before speaking headings aloud. His voice stayed controlled, but everyone heard the tighter cadence. Navigation error meant straying further from formation safety, and formation safety meant shared offensive fire and visual reassurance against sudden fighter attack. The radio operator continued working damaged equipment, rotating frequency dials through static that sounded like distant rainfall against metal roofs. Occasionally fragmented transmissions emerged, distorted but recognizable as human voices. Each broken signal reminded him that dozens of other crews were enduring similar mechanical failures, similar code, similar invisible calculations about survival margins. The knowledge offered strange comfort while increasing emotional weight. War created shared isolation, binding individuals through suffering they could not directly witness. He logged partial coordinates from one brief transmission, hoping it might help later if navigation instruments degraded further or visual reference vanished entirely. In the rear fuselage, the tail gunner fought increasing stiffness in turret rotation, forcing manual leverage against partially frozen gearing. Frost formed along ammunition belts, requiring him to flex glove fingers repeatedly just to maintain trigger sensitivity. His world had narrowed to a circular slice of sky, framed by scratched plexiglass and faint gun sight reticles. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of distant bombers shifting altitude, their silhouettes wobbling slightly from damage or fuel imbalance. He understood, without needing confirmation, that formation doctrine assumed mechanical symmetry, yet real combat replaced symmetry with individual struggle. The realization carried no panic, only a deeper awareness of how temporary collective strength could become. The pilot monitored the lead aircraft constantly, yet visual distortion from heat shimmer and smoke made judging distance unreliable. He increased power briefly to close spacing, then reduced again to protect the failing engine, repeating the cycle until it became a rhythm of compromise. Formation flight manuals described steady positioning as ideal, but reality forced constant negotiation between safety and mechanical survival. He remembered instructors emphasizing discipline above instinct, yet instinct now whispered that survival sometimes required small rule violations. Still, he held position as best he could, knowing that drifting too far meant losing overlapping defensive fire arcs that discouraged enemy fighters from committing attacks. The flight engineer watched fuel gauges descend with subtle irregularity, calculating crossfeed options if another engine lost efficiency. He tracked oil pressure variations with obsessive focus, memorizing tiny oscillations as if they were language. Mechanical stress translated into numbers first, but he knew numbers eventually became physical failure. He considered shutting the damaged engine down entirely, yet doing so would reduce speed further and risk permanent separation. Keeping it running risked fire or seizure. Every scenario contained unacceptable elements. Training offered procedures, but procedures assumed stable conditions, not cascading partial failures layered over combat damage and freezing altitude air. Below them, broken cloud layers revealed glimpses of farmland scarred by bomb craters and smoke plumes rising from industrial districts. The sight produced complicated emotion. They were participants in destruction, yet also men trying to survive machinery and physics determined to kill them without intention. The navigator thought briefly of home landscapes, fields untouched by shellfire, then forced the memory aside to focus on wind vector corrections. Emotional distraction cost seconds, and seconds now felt dangerously expensive. Around them, the formation stretched slightly wider, each aircraft fighting its own battle against drag, damage, and fuel mathematics. The tail gunner reported brief contrails forming high above, likely friendly escorts or distant interceptors repositioning. No one could confirm visually through layered haze. Uncertainty became constant companion. The radio operator logged time and estimated position anyway, maintaining record discipline, because documentation sometimes saved lives during rescue or investigation. Inside the cockpit, the pilot flexed aching shoulders, aware that physical fatigue reduced reaction speed. Hours of vibration and tension turned muscles rigid. He forced himself to breathe slowly, maintaining clarity despite adrenaline cycles. War demanded sustained precision long after the human body preferred collapse. Gradually, their aircraft settled into a slightly lower altitude band, still within sight of several bombers, but no longer protected by the densest defensive crossfire zone. The pilot accepted the new reality without discussion. Survival sometimes meant adjusting expectations quietly. The navigator confirmed revised fuel range, still viable if conditions held steady. The flight engineer rechecked all fire suppression systems, preparing mentally for worst-case outcomes. Each man understood the unspoken truth. They were now more exposed, more dependent on individual skill, and more aware how thin the barrier between flight and falling truly was. Yet discipline held them together internally even as external protection weakened. They spoke calmly, executed checklists, and monitored instruments with professional detachment. No one voiced fear, not because it was absent, but because it had been fully integrated into routine. The bomber continued forward, engines vibrating unevenly yet still producing thrust. Sunlight returned across the fuselage, reflecting from fresh scars cut by shrapnel. They were still moving toward home territory, carrying damage fatigue, and silent understanding that survival depended on maintaining focus for every remaining mile of sky ahead, always onward. The bomber shuddered once, violently, as if the aircraft itself were suddenly aware of the precariousness of its situation. The tail gunner's hands trembled slightly on the turret controls, gloves stiff from frost and hours of tension. He had made his choice, the one impossible decision that separated him from procedure manuals and training charts, and yet he did not flinch from the consequences. The aircraft continued forward, engines straining under uneven loads, the fuselage vibrating with the memory of every flak burst endured and every minor impact absorbed along the way. Inside, the crew settled into a brittle rhythm, each man aware that the mission was no longer simply about bombs or target coordinates. It was about endurance, about balancing human instinct against machine reliability under conditions where one wrong adjustment could mean catastrophe. The pilot held the yoke steady, muscles taut, eyes scanning the lead bomber and distant horizon for any sign of enemy movement or terrain anomalies. The aircraft was slower than designed, its weight distribution altered by earlier damage, but remained airborne, a fragile composite of metal, skill, and human will. In the cockpit, the smell of heated oil mingled with antiseptic cold, a sensory reminder that machinery and survival had fused into a single equation that demanded constant attention. The navigator adjusted charts yet again, making micro-corrections for drift, altitude, and airspeed, every calculation now shaded by the awareness that their position within the formation had been compromised. Visual cues from surrounding aircraft were increasingly unreliable. The protective density of the formation had thinned, leaving gaps that could not be entirely accounted for. Communication remained sporadic, radios struggling with interference, the static a constant whisper that reminded the radio operator how easily connection could vanish altogether. He toggled dials, his fingers numb, straining to maintain at least partial contact with distant wings, knowing that every fragment of information could become critical in the final miles home. Outside, the sky was both quiet and menacing. Clouds that had once offered camouflage now seemed like barriers, casting shadows that distorted perception and made it difficult to judge relative position. Flak had abetted in the immediate zone, but the memory of the burst lingered in every vibration and every subtle creak of the fuselage. The aircraft felt alive, a living system that demanded respect and constant adjustment, sensitive to every micro-change in speed, altitude, and mechanical function. The flight engineer monitored each gauge with obsessive attention, aware that even minor deviations could cascade into larger failures. Oil pressure, cylinder temperature, and fuel flow formed a dynamic equation. He had to keep in balance while accounting for ongoing physical stress and the environmental variables imposed by high-altitude flight. Every adjustment carried risk. Every second of inaction could be fatal. The aircraft responded to human input imperfectly. Each command filtered through damaged engines, weakened hydraulics, and frigid air that slowed mechanical response. The crew had learned, over long missions and countless hours of training, that survival depended as much on anticipating failure as responding to it. The pilot's hands were raw from glove friction and constant pressure, every micro-correction in negotiation with both metal and gravity. The bombardier leaned forward, peering through frost-misted glass, tracking the faint lines of distant terrain below. The target had been released, the bombs gone, yet the immediate danger was far from over. Enemy fighters could appear with little warning. Clouds offered concealment for attackers, and the aircraft itself was a compromised platform, weakened by previous impacts and structural stress. The bombardier kept sighting instruments calibrated, eyes flicking from horizon to altimeter to surrounding aircraft. Focus was the only defense against the quiet panic that hovered at the edge of awareness. Time passed strangely. Each minute contained layers of action, reflection, and anticipation. Every man processed fatigue differently. The navigator through calculation, the flight engineer through measurement, the gunners through vigilance, the pilot through tension and anticipation. Internal clocks measured risk in pulses of adrenaline, subtle shifts in vibration, and the steady decay of mechanical function. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, illuminating both scars and fuselage and the distant patchwork of farmland and towns below. Smoke from earlier attacks drifted upward in thin plumes, a visual echo of destruction that reinforced precariousness of every choice. The tail gunner reported minor changes in airflow around the turret, likely from structural stress elsewhere on the plane. He adjusted manually, muscles burning against cold, continuing to scan for fighter activity even as the formation thinned. The radio operator finally maintained a partial link with another bomber ahead, receiving fragmented headings that offered a sense of continuity within the wider operational picture. Still, isolation remained. The crew felt it collectively, a shared awareness that the aircraft's survival was dependent on individual skill more than any protective structure. Internal discipline became paramount. Each man adhered to procedure with quiet intensity, performing repeated checks, monitoring every gauge, and responding to minor vibrations as if they were urgent signals. Fear was present but contained, shaped into precision rather than panic. The aircraft continued forward, a wounded yet functioning system carrying them toward home. Each mile traversed was both relief and strain, the paradox of high-altitude survival layered with the unspoken understanding that every successful adjustment came at the cost of near-constant vigilance. As they cleared the immediate combat zone, the bomber's engine settled into uneven rhythm, vibrations dulling slightly but not disappearing. The crew's collective focus had shifted from mission completion to endurance, from executing attack procedures to managing survival variables. Subtle adjustments continued. Throttle corrections, rudder inputs, altitude stabilizations, and instrumentation cross-checks. Every creak of metal, every faint smell of heated oil, every flicker of light across the canopy contributed to the unspoken ledger of risk and response. Fatigue accumulated in ways measured not by exhaustion alone, but by the erosion of reflexive certainty. Each man aware that small errors now had amplified consequences. They were still alive, still moving, yet survival had transformed into a calculus of continuous attention, where emotional restraint, mechanical understanding, and instinctive skill converged. Each crew member understood in a quiet, resigned way that they had survived because of decisions made in moments of acute clarity, choices that combined training, instinct, and moral responsibility into actions that could not be undone. The aircraft, scarred and imperfect, remained a fragile but functional vessel, carrying them toward the tenuous safety of friendly airspace. Sunlight slanted across the fuselage one last time as they leveled slightly, engines humming with uneven but sufficient power. The bomber continued, a testament to endurance, precision, and the invisible weight of irreversible choices carried silently within its metal frame.